that are locked up in dead organic plant material, wood, etc., and then colonize it and then recycle it back into the ecosphere. And I think that all of us, whether we are willing or knowing or unknowing participants in this process, I think as time goes on, the importance of our being aware of these processes becomes paramount. So here's an example of Psilocybe azurescens, which is one of my favorite species right now, that is tenaciously holding together wood chips of alder. And this is what I seek as a cultivator to do, is to create a mycelial tenacity, a mycelial platform that is dense enough that you can then, this platform can explode into mushrooms or be used as spawn. And I have another book that I'm working on that should be out in the next year, which is a totally non-technical book about how to use transplantation techniques for moving mushroom mycelium from one place to another. And you can create a perennial psilocybin mushroom bed outdoors in your backyard. It's very, very easily done. So when we take things into culture, and this is from a spore germination, and this is Gymnopolis luteofolius, a very not well-known psilocybin active species that grows in parts of Europe here as well as northwestern North America. And what I look for as a cultivator is the general efficiency of a relatively thin mycelial mat producing a relatively large three-dimensional fruit body. And biological efficiencies of being able to adapt to substrates and producing mushrooms is one of the key ways of measuring edible mushroom production throughout the world. But we're in Amsterdam, so I can talk about this. So on the gills, there are these cells called basidia, and the basidia quickly enlarge, and then they ultimately give rise to more spores. So these are two young basidia, and they then go from this stage to the stage that you saw earlier to this stage, and these are four sterigmata, and from these four haploid spores will be produced. Now, for those of you who are kind of biologists, and this karyogamy occurs here, then meiosis, and then those four haploid spore packets migrate. And then you get a fully mature basidium. In this case, this is Pinus phonosecii. And these spores, as a beautiful symbolism of life on this planet, come off in pairs, and they are juxtapositioned. There was an article recently published to try to explain how these spores, which are only 9 to 12 microns in length, are thrown anywhere from 8 to 20 inches away from the mushrooms. And they're now called ballista spores, because it is now known that a little gas bubble forms here, and there's a sugar coating that forms on the outside of the spores, and because of electrostatic field differentials, the spores are thrown out with a force of 25,000 Gs. That's 10,000 more Gs necessary for this. 10,000 more Gs more than that which is necessary for the space shuttle astronauts to escape the gravitational pull of the Earth. So absolutely phenomenal. Okay, so going back now approximately 7,000 years in northern Algeria, at the Tisili Anajar Plateau, which roughly translates as the plateau of running rivers, thousands of cave art drawings were discovered in a labyrinthine complex of caves. And several dozen of these were found in 1947 by a French anthropologist named Lot and his Japanese photographer partner. And amazingly, if you can believe it, anthropologists for 30 or 40 years could not figure out what the intent of the artist was. This is why, the acknowledgement of the greatest achievement of science of the century, the acknowledgement of our ignorance, I guess so. This is this may well be the mushroom that was being enjoyed at the time. Of course, now because of the Sahara Desert, it is a very dry region. But Gary Linkoff went there a few years ago and found pine aster and this psilocybe mushroom coming out of it, and which we believe is psilocybe maryi. And here's another example of it. So what I want to go through is showing you several examples of different psilocybin active species and how to identify them. I'm not going to get heavy into taxonomy because there's not enough time, but I want to kind of survey the psilocybin mushroom map, so to speak, and point out some key species. In this another example from the western slope of Guatemala, where mushroom stones have been collected and unearthed over the past 100, 200 years. And it is thought that the mushroom stones were perhaps property boundaries, perhaps were family heirlooms, which signified family lineage, were passed down from one family to another over generations. But nevertheless, they were spiritually thought to be very, very potent. And these mushroom stones number now about 400 or 500 have been presently discovered. And there's a great iconography of the development of mushroom stones that the Japanese Tobacco Institute published a super book showing the delineation and evolution of different forms of mushroom stones at the encouragement of a woman nun by the name of Yvonne Summercamp, and she is now the head of a nunnery in Guatemala, and is a person that I highly recommend that people network with. So in 1957, May 13th, it really came to the attention of Americans when millions of copies of Life magazine were delivered to their homes. Now, this is in the middle of the Cold War, and in this was the first description of the use of mushrooms as visionary medicines, and featured Maria Sabina, and was written by R. Gordon Wasson, who is featured here. And even though that the village was disguised, thousands and tens of thousands of Americans began their trek into Mexico seeking the magic mushrooms. So amazingly, in Life magazine was a botanically very accurate field guide on how to identify Psilocybe cubensis, Psilocybe ceruleans, Psilocybe zapotecorum, on and on. So, I mean, this is just amazing because it's a super conservative time, and this magazine ends up, on the doorsteps of millions of Americans. Now, in the academic circles, this caused an uproar, and the intelligentsia of that time then really picked up the ball, and professors at the University of California at Berkeley, at Harvard, Cornell, Yale, lots of people started going down to Mexico to look for magic mushrooms.